Welcome, weary traveler, wherever you may be listening from tonight. Whether you're nestled in a quiet room as midnight falls or watching the first light of dawn from the other side of the world, we're glad you're here. We'd love to know where are you joining us from and what time marks the beginning of your journey into rest tonight. Share with us in the comments below. It's always wonderful to feel connected across time and space. Let's drift back together, far from the noise of today, to the final, flickering candle of the Western Roman Empire. Picture not just marble halls and legions, but something deeper. The slow, almost invisible currents of change that brought a civilization to its knees. This isn't a history lecture filled with dry facts and dates. It's a gentle story, a whispered lullaby of a fallen giant. We'll wander through the quiet, creeping shadows that slowly consumed a world where ambition faded and echoes of glory lingered in the twilight. So find a comfortable place, close your eyes, and let the story unfold. There's a certain melancholy beauty in the fall of something so mighty, a reminder that even the greatest empires are shaped by time, chance, and the quiet choices of countless souls. As we trace the arc of Rome's decline from vibrant strength to solemn silence, let the rhythm of this ancient tale ease your mind and carry you gently toward rest. The night holds many stories, and tonight we share one of the most enduring. A slow, majestic descent into history's embrace. At its height, the Roman Empire was a marvel of human achievement, a tapestry of cultures and peoples woven together under a single, seemingly unshakable authority. For nearly 200 years, a period we now call the Pax Romana, the Roman world experienced a stability that was virtually unheard of before and would be rare for centuries to come. This was not merely an absence of war, but a profound and organized peace enforced by the might of the legions and the wisdom of its administrators. Imagine a world where a merchant could travel from the rainy hills of northern Britain all the way to the sun-baked markets of Egypt with a common currency in his purse and the protection of Roman law guaranteeing his safety. The Mediterranean Sea, once a chaotic web of rival territories and pirate fleets, had become a tranquil Roman lake, its shores dotted with identical harbors, granaries, and temples to the imperial cult. Grand stone-paved roads stretched like arteries across the landscape, carrying not just soldiers and officials, but also ideas, innovations, and a shared identity. Aqueducts, those breathtaking feats of engineering, carried fresh water to bustling cities, supporting public baths, fountains, and a standard of urban living that would not be matched again for over 1,000 years. This immense system was held together by the figure of the emperor, a succession of rulers known as the Five Good Emperors who presided over this golden age with a combination of military competence, diplomatic skill, and a genuine interest in public welfare. They built monuments not just to their own glory, but for the benefit of the people, libraries, forums, and immense public works that served as the bedrock of civilized life. It was a time of such profound order and prosperity that it must have felt to the people living within it as if it would last forever. The sheer scale of its accomplishment cast a long, confident shadow, making the notion of its decline seem almost impossible. This peak, this moment of perfect equilibrium, is where our story truly starts, for to understand the fall, we must first appreciate the incredible height from which it tumbled. Yet, even during this golden age, beneath the gleaming marble and the grand spectacles, the first hairline fractures were beginning to show in the empire's foundation. The sheer administrative burden of governing such a colossal territory was staggering. Think of the paperwork required to administer dozens of provinces, each with its own local customs, languages, and potential for unrest. A vast, sprawling bureaucracy grew in Rome to manage it all, a network of officials, tax collectors, and provincial governors that became increasingly expensive to maintain. This immense machine was fueled by a constant and enormous flow of wealth, primarily in the form of taxes and grain, siphoned from the farthest reaches of the empire to feed the capital city and its armies. Simple animations could trace this relentless flow precious metals mined in Spain, wheat harvested in Egypt and North Africa, all flowing along those vaunted roads and sea lanes not for trade, but as tribute heading inexorably toward the heart of the empire. This system created a dangerous dependency. Rome itself, with its immense population, became a consumer city, reliant on the provinces for its very survival. The free grain dole for its citizens, while a brilliant tool for maintaining public order, was a massive and continuous drain on the imperial treasury. To pay for this, the empire needed a constant stream of new conquests to plunder, a source of wealth that simply could not last forever. Once the expansion stopped under Emperor Trajan, the financial pressure began to mount. The state's expenses, from the legion's salaries to the construction of monumental vanity projects, were fixed and enormous, while its income became less reliable. There was also a quieter, more philosophical decay at work, a gradual shift away from the old republican virtues of discipline, civic duty, and simplicity that had fueled its rise. As luxury and immense wealth flowed into the capital, a culture of entitlement and corruption began to seep into the ruling class. The stern, pragmatic values that built the republic were slowly being eclipsed by a desire for personal glory and comfort. The state was like a magnificent but deeply complex clockwork mechanism. Every gear, from the lowliest tax collector in Gaul to the emperor himself, had to function perfectly. The immense strain of keeping it all synchronized, of ensuring the provinces remained quiet and productive, was a silent, constant weight. It was a system designed for perpetual growth, and when that growth finally halted, the structure itself began to feel the unsustainable pressure. And then the clockwork broke. The golden age of stability gave way to a storm of unimaginable chaos known as the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period where the empire nearly devoured itself. The carefully constructed image of a unified, eternal Rome shattered into fragments, replaced by the brutal reality of civil war. The legions, once the proud defenders of the frontier, now turned their swords against each other. Their loyalty was no longer to the Senate or the people of Rome, but to the general who commanded them, the man who could promise them the greatest plunder and pay. Ambitious commanders in Gaul, in Syria, along the Danube, each saw a chance to seize the purple for themselves, leading to a dizzying parade of over 20 emperors in just 5 decades. Most ruled for only a few months or years before being overthrown or assassinated by the next usurper. Imagine the scene: Roman soldiers, clad in identical armor, fighting to the death against their own countrymen on blood-soaked fields, not for an ideal, but for the fleeting ambition of a rival general. The empire was at war with itself, and its borders were left dangerously exposed. This internal weakness was an invitation the outside world was eager to accept. With the legions pulled away to fight each other, the vast frontiers that had seemed so impenetrable during the Pax Romana suddenly became porous and vulnerable. Germanic tribes like the Franks and the Alemanni poured across the Rhine River into Gaul. The Goths launched devastating raids across the Danube, while in the east, a newly resurgent Persian empire under the Sassanid dynasty captured the Emperor Valerian himself in a staggering humiliation. The famous image of the Persian king using the captured Roman emperor as a footstool to mount his horse was a symbol of how far Roman prestige had fallen. But perhaps the most insidious collapse was an economic one. To pay for the endless civil wars and to buy the loyalty of the armies, emperors began to drastically debase the silver currency. They reduced the precious metal content in the coins, minting more and more of them with less and less real value. This led to runaway hyperinflation, a situation where prices spiraled out of control. A measure of wheat that cost a handful of coins one year might cost a sackful the next. The trust in the very money that had once facilitated trade across the known world evaporated. Barter replaced coinage, and the complex economic system that supported urban life began to crumble. cities, the very heart of Roman civilization, became poorer, more dangerous, and began to build defensive walls, shrinking in on themselves for protection. It was a perfect storm of military anarchy, foreign invasion, and economic collapse. The Roman world was fractured into three competing states before the soldier Emperor Aurelian painfully stitched it back together. He was hailed as the restorer of the world, but the world he restored was forever weakened, forever scarred by the trauma of near-total disintegration. The crisis had proven that the empire was not invincible. It had looked into the abyss and had barely managed to step back. Out of the smoking ruins of the 3rd century, a savior emerged in the formidable figure of Diocletian, an emperor of humble origins who possessed a will of iron and a mind for radical, systematic reform. He looked upon the fractured, bleeding empire and concluded that its very size was its greatest weakness. It was simply too vast for any one man to govern and defend from the myriad threats now pressing in on all sides. His solution was not a gentle fix, but a complete top-down restructuring of the entire Roman state. A profound reorganization so comprehensive it was as if he was building a new empire atop the old foundations. His most famous and far-reaching innovation was the Tetrarchy, or the Rule of Four. Diocletian divided the sprawling empire into two administrative halves, east and west. He would rule the more wealthy and stable east himself from a new capital at Nicomedia, while appointing a trusted colleague, Maximian, as his co-emperor or Augustus to rule the more vulnerable west from Milan. But Diocletian's genius, or perhaps his folly, was in looking beyond his own reign. To solve the bloody problem of succession that had fueled decades of civil war, each Augustus was to adopt a junior deputy, a Caesar, who would be their designated heir. So the Western Augustus had a Caesar for Gaul and Britain, and the Eastern Augustus had a Caesar for the Balkans. Imagine a clear map animation now, the familiar shape of the Roman Empire cleanly splitting down the middle, not along a natural border but a line drawn by administrative necessity, each half then subdividing again, creating 4 regional seats of power from York to Syria, each with its own ruler, its own court, and its own army. This was a system designed for speed and local control, allowing threats on the frontier to be met instantly by a nearby emperor without waiting for orders from a distant Rome. To support this new military and political structure, Diocletian performed surgery on the provinces themselves, slicing the existing ones into smaller, more manageable units, then grouping them into 12 massive dioceses, each overseen by a vicarius reporting to a praetorian prefect, who in turn reported to one of the 4 emperors. It was a breathtakingly complex pyramid of command, a bureaucracy of unprecedented scale meant to bring order from chaos. For a time, it worked brilliantly. The frontiers were shored up, usurpers were kept at bay, and the endless civil wars ceased. But in creating this system, Diocletian had, perhaps unintentionally, formalized a division that would prove permanent. He had created 2 Romes, one Latin-speaking and increasingly strained in the west, and one Greek-speaking and far richer in the east. The Tetrarchy was a mechanism of incredible strength, but it was held together by the immense personal authority of Diocletian himself. It was a system that demanded perfect harmony between 4 powerful men, and as history had already shown, such harmony was the rarest of commodities in the Roman world. Diocletian's intricate system of 4 rulers ultimately proved too fragile to outlast its creator, but from the ensuing struggle for power arose a figure who would leave a mark on the world far deeper than any administrative reform. Constantine, later known as the Great, emerged victorious from a series of civil wars, miraculously reuniting the entire empire under his sole rule by the year 324. Yet his true, earth-shattering legacy was not this political reunification, which would prove tragically temporary, but a spiritual revolution that would permanently redefine Western civilization. In the year 313, Constantine and his co-emperor in the east, Licinius, issued the Edict of Milan. this was not merely a law, it was a declaration of a profound new reality. Christianity, a faith that had been brutally persecuted by Diocletian just a decade earlier, was now not only legal but officially tolerated throughout the empire. For the first time, a Roman emperor had thrown the immense weight of the state behind this once obscure sect. This was a transformation that reached into the very soul of Roman life. The old pagan world, with its myriad gods governing every aspect of nature and state, began a slow but irrevocable retreat. The ancient rites that had defined Roman identity for a millennium, the sacrifices to Jupiter for the empire's success, the household prayers to the lares and penates gradually lost their central place in public life. The emperor was no longer the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the old state religion. In the same way, Constantine presented himself as a servant of God, a divinely chosen leader for a new era. His role shifted from a distant, god-like ruler to a more paternal, spiritual shepherd for his people, setting a powerful precedent for the relationship between church and state that would echo for centuries. This new alliance between throne and altar became visible in stone and mortar. With imperial funding and encouragement, the landscape of the empire was physically transformed. Gone were the days of Christians worshipping in discreet house churches. In their place rose the first great basilicas, monumental structures designed to accommodate thousands of worshippers and reflect the glory of God and his imperial patron. The most famous of these was Old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a magnificent church built over what was believed to be the burial site of the Apostle Peter. Its vast nave, soaring arches, and glittering mosaics were a stark contrast to the dark, cramped spaces of secret worship. These buildings were not just places of prayer, they were powerful statements. They proclaimed that the Christian God was now the source of imperial favor, and that the empire's future was inextricably linked to this faith. The visual culture of the empire evolved to reflect this new spiritual order. Artists began to blend traditional Roman imperial imagery with Christian symbolism. In magnificent mosaics, Constantine might be depicted receiving a victory wreath not from the goddess Victoria, but from the hand of God. The Chi-Rho symbol, which Constantine reportedly saw in a vision before a crucial battle, began to appear on imperial standards and coins. This merging of iconography created a new visual language where the power of the emperor was legitimized by Christian divinity, and the Christian story was told with the artistic grandeur formerly reserved for pagan myths and imperial triumphs. It was a peaceful invasion of the public sphere, a quiet but monumental shift that saw the cross slowly eclipse the eagle as the defining symbol of a world in transition. Constantine's conversion did not instantly Christianize the empire. Paganism would persist in pockets for generations, but it set in motion an irreversible current. He had redirected the immense river of Roman imperial tradition, channeling its authority, its resources, and its artistic genius into a new faith, fundamentally altering the cultural and spiritual bedrock upon which Europe would later be built. Yet for all his efforts to forge a new spiritual and political unity, the division Diocletian had formalized between East and West was now a permanent and deepening reality. This split became starkly evident after Constantine's death, as the empire was once again divided among his sons, and the western half began its slow, inexorable slide into a different kind of crisis. The East, with its ancient, wealthy cities like Alexandria and Antioch and its thriving trade networks, possessed a stronger economic base that could better support the immense cost of defending its frontiers. The West, by contrast, was poorer, more rural, and its long border along the Rhine and Danube was a magnet for trouble. And trouble was coming not as a single dramatic event, but as a slow, tectonic shift of peoples that would gradually overwhelm the empire's ability to respond. The story of these so-called barbarian invasions is often told as a sudden, violent storm that broke upon Rome, but in truth, it was a far more complex and gradual process. For centuries, there had been a steady, managed trickle of Germanic peoples across the frontiers, young men joining the Roman army, entire tribes granted land in exchange for military service. The empire had always been able to absorb and Romanize these groups, but in the 4th century, the pressure changed from a manageable trickle to an unstoppable flood, and the catalyst for this change came from the distant steppes of Central Asia. The arrival of the Huns, a nomadic confederation of fierce horsemen, sent a shockwave through the Germanic world. Their terrifying appearance and ruthless tactics pushed other tribes westward toward the Roman borders in a desperate search for safety. First came the Goths, a large grouping of tribes who found themselves caught between the advancing Huns and the Danube River, the border of the Roman Empire. In the year 376, they appeared on the riverbank in vast numbers, not just warriors, but entire communities of men, women, and children with their wagons and their livestock. They were refugees pleading with the Roman Emperor Valens to be allowed to cross into the safety of imperial territory. Seeing an opportunity to gain new soldiers and taxpayers, Valens agreed, but the settlement was catastrophically mismanaged. Roman officials, corrupt and greedy, exploited the starving Goths, selling them dog meat in exchange for their children as slaves. This cruel treatment sparked a revolt, and the Goths, now desperate and enraged, began to plunder the rich Roman province of Thrace. The Roman response culminated in the Battle of Adrianople in 378, one of the most decisive military disasters in Roman history. The Emperor Valens, arrogant and impatient, engaged the Gothic cavalry without waiting for reinforcements from his nephew in the west. The Roman legions were outmaneuvered and surrounded by the Gothic horsemen. The infantry was crushed and Valens himself was killed, his body never recovered. The defeat was a profound shock. A full Roman field army, and an emperor with it, had been annihilated by a force of barbarians inside the empire's own territory. It proved that these groups were not mere raiders. They could be a lethal, organized military threat. In the decades that followed, the nature of the barbarian presence changed completely. Groups like the Goths, the Vandals, and the Franks were no longer just invaders to be defeated. They became permanent, autonomous powers within the empire's borders, operating through a complex mix of warfare and negotiation. The Vandals, for instance, undertook an incredible journey, moving from Spain, crossing the Strait of Gibraltar, and carving out a kingdom for themselves in the rich provinces of North Africa, the very breadbasket of the Western Empire. From there, their formidable navy disrupted Mediterranean trade and even sacked the city of Rome itself in 455. The Western emperors, increasingly weak and isolated in places like Ravenna, which was easier to defend than Rome, had little choice but to negotiate with these powerful groups within their midst. They would grant them formal status as foederati or allied troops and assign them tracts of land to settle. In return, these groups were expected to defend the empire from other, often newer, invaders. This policy was a desperate attempt to buy loyalty and secure the frontiers, but it effectively created independent Germanic kingdoms inside the Roman state, acknowledging a reality that Roman military power could no longer change. The barbarians were not mindless destroyers. They were often drawn to Roman culture, aspiring to its comforts and its stability. They sought not to erase Rome, but to find a place for themselves within its world, even as their very presence fundamentally and irrevocably altered it. Into this world of collapsing frontiers and migrating peoples strode a figure who would become the ultimate symbol of terror for a dying empire. Attila, king of the Huns, a man whom frightened chroniclers would later call the scourge of God. While the Goths and Vandals sought lands and a place within the Roman world, Attila's aim was far simpler and more devastating. He sought to plunder its very core. He did not lead a people looking for a new home. He commanded a mobile, ruthless confederation of steppe warriors whose entire economy and culture were built around war and the extraction of wealth from settled civilizations. His rise to power began alongside his brother Bleda, but after a few years, Attila alone held the reins, unifying the Hunnic tribes under his fierce and ambitious leadership. The source of his terrifying power lay in his unparalleled cavalry. His warriors, practically born in the saddle, could fire arrows with deadly accuracy from horseback at a full gallop, using composite bows that outranged any weapon the Romans possessed. Their mobility was breathtaking. They could appear seemingly out of nowhere, strike with lightning speed, and vanish back into the plains before a Roman legion could even be mustered to respond. They were the nightmare of every settled community along the Danube. For over a decade, Attila turned this military machine against the vulnerable Eastern Roman Empire, launching raid after raid into the Balkans. He systematically sacked and destroyed cities from Margus to Naissus, leaving a trail of smoldering ruins and generating a river of refugees that flowed into Constantinople itself. The Eastern Emperor Theodosius II was utterly powerless to stop him. Desperate for respite, he agreed to pay Attila a massive annual tribute of gold, literally buying peace from the Hunnic king. This gold, hundreds of pounds of it every year, flowed out of Constantinople and into Attila's coffers, further financing his ambitions and tightening his grip on his own followers, who were rewarded richly for their loyalty. For a time, the Eastern Empire was reduced to a tributary state, its grandeur humbled by the demands of a nomadic chieftain it could not defeat. But the flow of Eastern gold eventually began to slow, and Attila's gaze turned westward toward the richer, albeit more chaotic, provinces of the Roman West. His pretext for invasion was almost laughably domestic. A letter from the sister of the Western Emperor, Valentinian III, named Honoria. Facing a forced marriage to a man she despised, she reportedly sent a ring to Attila and asked for his help. Whether this was a genuine plea or a courtly rumor, Attila seized upon it, declaring the princess his bride and demanding half of the Western Empire as her dowry. When his demand was refused, the full force of the Hunnic Confederation, swelled by the armies of subject Germanic tribes, descended into Gaul. The clash that followed was one of the last great set-piece battles of the ancient world. In the year 451, on the Catalonian plains in modern-day France, Attila's Huns met a combined Roman and Visigothic army, led by the last great Roman general Flavius Aetius. The battle was a brutal, day-long slaughter of unimaginable scale. Though often remembered as a victory that stopped Attila, the outcome was indecisive. The Huns were checked but not destroyed. The following year, Attila invaded Italy itself, his horsemen leaving scars on the landscape that would be remembered for centuries. He razed the great city of Aquileia to the ground so completely that its refugees would later found a new settlement in the lagoons, the future Venice. The road to Rome itself now seemed open, and panic gripped the eternal city. But then the story takes a sudden, unexpected turn. According to legend, Attila was met outside Rome by a delegation led by Pope Leo I. What exactly was said during that meeting is lost to history, but immediately afterward, Attila turned his army around and retreated. Perhaps it was the persuasive power of the Pope. More likely, his army was weakened by disease and starvation, and he feared news of an attack on his homelands. He returned to his vast encampment on the Hungarian plains, his power still immense but his momentum broken. Then, in the year 453, on the night after his marriage to a young Gothic bride named Ildiko, Attila suffered a severe nosebleed while lying in a drunken stupor and choked to death on his own blood. It was a bizarre, almost mundane end for a man who had held continents in fear. His empire, built entirely on the force of his own personality and the loyalty he bought with gold, had no successor strong enough to hold it together. His sons fought among themselves, the subject tribes rose in revolt, and the mighty Hunnic Confederation disintegrated almost as quickly as it had arisen. The scourge of God was gone, but the damage was done. The Western Empire, bled white by his campaigns and the tributes paid to appease him, was left staggering. its defenses shattered and its treasury empty, teetering on the brink of a final, silent collapse. Yet even the ravages of Attila could not compare to the profound symbolic shock of an event that had occurred decades earlier, an event that had sent a tremor through the entire civilized world and shattered an illusion that had stood for 800 years. In the year 410, the unthinkable became reality. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, a people who had been pushed to the brink by Roman treachery and hunger, stood before the gates of Rome. His was not a horde of wild barbarians. His men were largely Christian, many of them former soldiers of the empire itself, and they had come not for mindless destruction, but as a desperate, angry force demanding recognition and a homeland. For years, Alaric had tried to negotiate with the paralyzed Western court, then based in Ravenna, bargaining for land and official status for his people. But the emperor, a weak and indecisive ruler named Honorius, repeatedly broke his promises, believing the eternal city was untouchable. Exhausted and enraged by this betrayal, Alaric finally lost patience. In late August, his forces surrounded Rome, and the unthinkable began to unfold. For the first time since a Gallic invasion some 8 centuries prior, the sacred boundary of the city's walls was breached. The Visigoths entered Rome not through a dramatic, cinematic battle, but through a treacherously opened gate, a final, ignominious failure of the city's own defenses. For 3 days, Alaric allowed his troops to plunder the city. Yet, contrary to the savage imagery the word sack often conjures, this was a controlled, almost orderly process of acquisition. The Goths, many of them Arian Christians, showed a degree of restraint that would have been unthinkable for a true foreign invader. They respected the sanctity of certain churches, most famously the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul, which were designated as places of sanctuary. The violence, while certainly present, was not the primary goal. The real target was wealth, the accumulated treasures of the ancient capital, the gold, silver, and precious goods that had flowed into the city for centuries. But the true impact of the sack was not measured in stolen gold or damaged buildings. It was a psychological and spiritual cataclysm. The news radiated out from Italy like a shockwave, leaving disbelief and despair in its wake. To the subjects of the empire, from a bureaucrat in Alexandria to a farmer in Britain, Rome was not just a city. It was the very embodiment of civilization, order, and the divine favor of the gods. It was the caput mundi, the head of the world, an eternal, inviolable idea. Its fall was to them as incomprehensible as the sun failing to rise. The event shook the intellectual foundations of the entire Mediterranean world. In faraway Bethlehem, the theologian Saint Jerome heard the news and was so distraught he could barely continue his work. "My voice sticks in my throat," he wrote, "and sobs choke my utterance. The city which had taken the whole world is itself taken." The pagans saw it as a direct punishment for abandoning the old gods who had made Rome great, while the Christians, like Saint Augustine, were forced to grapple with the event in his monumental work, The City of God, arguing that the true eternal city was not of this world. The sack of Rome in 410 was more than a military defeat. It was the moment the grand narrative of unstoppable Roman destiny irrevocably broke. The eternal city had proven itself mortal, and with that single, stark revelation, the confidence that had underpinned a millennium of history simply vanished into the August air. And so, the great machinery of the Western Roman Empire did not so much crash as it simply wound down. After the departure of Attila and the slow disintegration of his confederation, the West entered its final twilight phase, a half-century-long epilogue where the title of emperor became little more than a hollow echo of its former self. The real power, the ability to command armies and make decisions of state, had decisively shifted. It no longer resided with the man wearing the purple in the palace, but with the man who controlled the palace guard and the remaining field armies, the Magister Militum, the master of soldiers. These were almost invariably men of barbarian birth, powerful Germanic generals who understood that propping up a puppet emperor was far more effective than claiming the throne for themselves and inviting the jealousy of rivals. The first and perhaps greatest of these was Stilicho, a Vandal by descent but a Roman in every other way, who served as the guardian of the weak Emperor Honorius. For over a decade, Stilicho was the de facto ruler of the West, a skilled commander who fought off multiple threats with a shrinking pool of resources. His fate, however, was a grim preview of what was to come. Despite his loyalty and service, he fell victim to court intrigues in Ravenna, accused of plotting to put his own son on the throne. In the year 408, he was arrested and executed on the orders of the very emperor he had dedicated his life to protecting. It was a catastrophic miscalculation by Honorius, a self-inflicted wound that robbed the West of its most capable defender just as Alaric's Goths were bearing down on Italy. The lesson was clear: the emperor could destroy his most powerful general, but he could no longer rule without one. This pattern of powerful generals and powerless emperors became the defining feature of the empire's final decades. The most extreme example was Flavius Ricimer, a man of Suevic and Gothic ancestry who, for nearly 2 decades, was the true power behind the crumbling Western throne. From the year 456 until his death in 472, Ricimer effectively ruled the West. He did so not by becoming emperor himself, but by a relentless cycle of appointing, deposing, and sometimes even executing a series of short-lived compliant figureheads. He raised 4 different men to the imperial throne, each one a shadow emperor who reigned only at Ricimer's pleasure. When one outlived his usefulness or showed a hint of independence, he was swiftly removed. The Emperor Majorian, a capable and energetic ruler whom Ricimer initially supported, began to enact serious reforms to restore the empire's finances and military. Seeing a threat to his own dominance, Ricimer turned on him, had him arrested, and executed him in 461 after just 4 years of rule. It was the ultimate paradox. The general was so powerful that he could destroy any emperor who showed the very strength the empire so desperately needed. The state was caught in a vicious cycle where survival depended on a strong general, but a strong general ensured that no strong emperor could ever emerge to truly save it. The stage for this slow-motion collapse was the city of Ravenna. In the early 5th century, the imperial court had abandoned Rome, moving its capital to this distant, marshy city in northeastern Italy. Surrounded by impenetrable swamps and formidable fortifications, Ravenna was chosen for its defensibility, a place to hide from the threats now roaming Italy. But this move came at a profound cost. The emperor became isolated, cut off from the symbolic power of Rome, and increasingly detached from the realities of his remaining provinces. The court in Ravenna became a world unto itself, a place of Byzantine intrigue, whispered plots, and a desperate clinging to the empty rituals of power while the world outside its walls steadily fell away. Imagine the scene: a damp, gloomy city of magnificent mosaics and grand churches, where courtiers still debated points of protocol and emperors issued decrees that scarcely carried authority beyond the next town, all while the true masters of the empire, the barbarian generals, decided the fate of millions with a nod or a command. And the empire itself was shrinking, its borders contracting like a drying puddle on a hot day. A time-lapse map would show the vibrant color of imperial control steadily fading from the edges inward. Britain had been abandoned by the legions as early as 410, left to its own devices. Most of Spain was lost to the Suebi and the Visigoths. Gaul was a patchwork of competing barbarian kingdoms, with only a thin sliver of imperial control along the Rhone River. But the single most catastrophic loss was that of North Africa. In 429, the Vandal king Gaiseric led his people across the Strait of Gibraltar, and within a decade had conquered Rome's richest remaining province. This was a mortal blow. Africa was the granary of the West, the source of the taxes and grain that fed the city of Rome and funded what was left of the government. With Africa gone, the financial lifeblood of the Western Empire was severed. The flow of gold and wheat stopped, and the already crippled economy went into its final, terminal decline. The empire could lose legions and even emperors, but it could not survive the loss of its treasury. The final emperors in Ravenna were pathetic figures, little more than local Italian nobles elevated by a general or by the emperor in Constantinople to lend a thin veneer of legitimacy to a corpse. They had no army, no money, and no authority. They were ghosts presiding over a ghost of an empire, their names and brief reigns recorded only as a formality in the history books, a sad footnote to the end of a world. And so we arrive at the year 476, the date etched into history books as the official end of the Western Roman Empire. In the isolated, waterlocked capital of Ravenna, the last in a long line of powerless figureheads sat on the throne. His name was Romulus Augustulus, a name heavy with unintended irony, combining the legendary founder of Rome with the title of its first emperor. Yet he was himself little more than a boy, a child emperor placed there by his father, a Roman general named Augustus. The real power, as had been the case for decades, lay with the army, and the army was now almost entirely composed of Germanic mercenaries. These soldiers, who had long defended the empire for pay and land, now made a final demand. They wanted a full third of the land in Italy for themselves. When Augustus refused, the soldiers turned to another chieftain, a man named Odoacer. Odoacer, of Syrian descent, was a product of the empire's own making, a seasoned warrior who had risen through the ranks of the Roman military. He agreed to the soldiers' terms, turned on Augustus, defeated and killed him, and then marched on Ravenna. There was no great dramatic siege. The city, accustomed to such shifts in power, likely offered little resistance. Odoacer entered the palace, confronted the young emperor, and on the 4th of September 476 he deposed him. The event itself was not a bloody coup. Romulus was not executed. Given his youth and powerlessness, he was seen as more of a pawn than a threat. Odoacer, showing a strange mercy, pensioned him off to a comfortable retirement in a fortified villa in Campania, a fate far kinder than that of most deposed Roman emperors. But what happened next was far more significant than the deposition itself. Odoacer did not follow the well-worn path of previous barbarian strongmen. He did not proclaim himself emperor of the West. He did not even attempt to continue the charade of a separate Western court. Instead, he made a decision of profound symbolic importance. He gathered up the imperial regalia, the purple cloak, the diadem, the other sacred ornaments of office, and had them carefully packaged. He then sent a delegation to the Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, the ruler of the still vibrant Eastern Roman Empire. The message was clear and deliberate. Odoacer declared that the West no longer required its own emperor. He acknowledged Zeno as the sole emperor of the entire Roman world and asked that Zeno formally grant him the authority to govern Italy as its ruler, which the Eastern emperor eventually did, granting Odoacer the title of patrician. This was not an act of conquest in the traditional sense. It was an act of administrative simplification. The sending of the regalia was the final, quiet admission that the separate Western Roman Empire, as a functioning political entity, had ceased to be. The throne in Ravenna had been empty in all but name for generations, occupied by phantoms and puppets. Odoacer was merely the one who had the pragmatism to officially clear it away. Life for the average person in Italy did not change overnight. The sun rose the next day as it always had. Farmers tended their fields, priests conducted services in their churches, and local officials continued to administer towns. Odoacer and the kings who followed him often kept the old Roman administrative systems intact because they worked. Latin remained the language of law and commerce, and Roman law continued to influence legal codes for centuries. The fall was not a sudden explosion, but the final drip from a leak that had been pouring for 100 years. The event of 476 was not the cause of the collapse. It was the official paperwork, the formal recognition of a death that had already occurred. It was the moment the doctor finally signs the certificate, long after the patient's heart has stopped beating. The empire had not been murdered in its prime. It had simply faded away after a long and wearying illness, its final breath a sigh of resignation rather than a scream of defeat. The empty throne in Ravenna stood not as a monument to a violent end, but to a quiet conclusion, the closing of a chapter that everyone had already finished reading. While the last Western emperor was being ushered into quiet retirement, a very different scene was unfolding over 1,000 miles to the east, for in the majestic city of Constantinople, the Roman Empire was not merely surviving. It was thriving with a vitality that would have been unrecognizable in the crumbling palaces of Ravenna. The year 476, so pivotal in the West, was just another year in the long, unbroken history of what we now call the Byzantine Empire, though its citizens never used that term. To them and to the world for centuries, they were simply Romans, the direct and legitimate heirs to Augustus and Constantine, presiding over an empire that would endure for nearly 1,000 years after the West had faded away. This staggering longevity was not a matter of luck, but the result of profound structural advantages that created a fortress of stability while the West disintegrated. The most immediate and visible symbol of the East's resilience were the mighty Theodosian Walls. Imagine a series of immense stone barriers, not just a single wall, but a layered masterpiece of military engineering. An enormous outer wall, a wider inner wall soaring over 60 feet high with nearly 100 towering towers, and a deep, wide moat that could be flooded. This triple defense system stretched for over 4 miles across the landward side of the city, making Constantinople virtually impregnable to direct assault. Built in the early 5th century, these walls were a statement in stone. They represented a long-term commitment to defense that the West, with its perpetually breached frontiers, could never muster. For 1,000 years, they repelled every army that approached, from Huns and Avars to Arabs and Bulgars, allowing life within the city to continue with a sense of security that had vanished in Rome. The walls were constantly maintained and improved, a civic duty that reflected the collective will to survive that was the empire's greatest asset. Behind these formidable defenses pulsed the economic heart of the ancient world. While the Western economy fractured into a messy patchwork of local barter systems, the East enjoyed a powerful, diverse, and cash-based economy. Constantinople itself sat at the crossroads of global trade, a bottleneck for the lucrative routes between Europe and Asia. The silk, spices, and gems of the East flowed through its harbors, generating immense customs duties that filled the imperial treasury with a reliable stream of gold solidi, coins that remained pure and trusted for centuries. This wealth was not concentrated in one place. The East possessed several vibrant, populous cities, Antioch, Alexandria, Ephesus, that continued to produce goods, generate taxes, and support a complex urban life long after their Western counterparts had shrunk behind their walls and decayed. Most crucially, the East retained control of its agricultural breadbaskets, like the fertile lands of Egypt, which provided the grain to feed the capital without interruption. This economic stability funded a professional, standing army and a salaried bureaucracy, the two pillars of state power that had completely eroded in the West. This stability was reinforced by a tradition of more consistent and often more capable leadership. The court in Constantinople certainly had its share of intrigues and palace coups, but it avoided the fatal pattern of the West, where barbarian generals reduced the emperor to a powerless puppet. The Eastern Emperor, or Basilius, was a far more authoritative figure, ruling from a position of immense symbolic and religious power as God's vice-regent on earth. Succession, while rarely smooth, was more often managed within the imperial family, providing a degree of continuity. This allowed for the reign of formidable rulers like Justinian the Great in the 6th century, who, with his brilliant general Belisarius, launched a stunning campaign to reconquer much of the lost Western territories, including Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain. Though this reconquest would ultimately overstretch the empire, it was a breathtaking demonstration of the power that the East still commanded generations after the West had fallen. The ultimate expression of this enduring power and piety was the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. Rebuilt by Justinian after a riot, it was a marvel that dwarfed anything in the West. Its colossal dome, seeming to float on a halo of light from 40 windows, was an architectural achievement that defied the physics of the age. The interior was a breathtaking spectacle of glittering gold mosaics, polished marble from every corner of the empire, and vast open space that inspired awe in every visitor. A contemporary historian wrote that it seemed as if the dome was suspended from heaven by a golden chain. The Hagia Sophia was not just a church, it was the soul of the empire, a physical manifestation of its wealth, its technological prowess, and its unshakable belief in its divine mission. It stood for centuries as the center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, a daily reminder to the citizens of Constantinople that they were the guardians of the true Roman flame, a flame that would continue to burn brightly long after the shadows had settled over the West. The engine of Rome's power was its economy, a sophisticated network of trade, taxation, and currency that spanned the known world. Yet this very engine began to falter, its complex mechanisms seizing up one by one until the entire system shuddered to a stop. The most visible and tangible symptom of this economic decay was the catastrophic devaluation of its currency, a process that eroded not just the value of a coin, but the very trust that held the economic world together. For centuries, the Roman denarius had been a symbol of reliability, a silver coin of consistent weight and purity that was accepted from the misty highlands of Scotland to the bustling docks of Alexandria. It was more than money, it was a token of Roman authority and stability, but that reliability was sacrificed to the relentless pressure of constant crisis. Beginning in the 3rd century, emperors faced with the enormous costs of defending the frontiers, paying the legions, and funding civil wars against rivals found a dangerously easy solution. They began to mint more coins, but to do so, they systematically reduced the amount of precious silver in each denarius, mixing in larger and larger quantities of base metals like copper or bronze. At first, the silver content was merely diluted, but over time the decline was staggering. A coin that was nearly pure silver in the time of Augustus had, by the reign of Gallienus 2.5 centuries later, become a copper piece with the faintest silver wash, a hollow imitation of its former self. This practice, known as debasement, was a short-term fix that created a long-term disaster. The government could now pay its bills with freshly minted, cheaper coins, but the market was not fooled. As people realized the coins in their purses were worth less in intrinsic value, they demanded more of them for the same goods. This triggered a vicious cycle of inflation that spiraled completely out of control. Prices for essential goods like grain, oil, and wine skyrocketed, while the real value of soldiers' salaries and government fixed-rate payments plummeted. The state responded by minting ever more debased currency to keep up, which only made the inflation worse. There are accounts from the period of prices rising so rapidly that a shopper might need a wagon full of coins just to buy a week's worth of food. The trust that had taken centuries to build was destroyed in a few generations. The Roman world began to abandon its own currency, reverting to the ancient practice of barter, trading a sack of grain for a pair of shoes, a chicken for a piece of pottery. The sophisticated cash economy that fueled urban life and long-distance trade was collapsing into a localized, inefficient system of swap and exchange. This monetary chaos made the empire's already burdensome tax system utterly suffocating. The Roman state had always required immense revenue to function, funding its massive army, its sprawling bureaucracy, and the grand public works that maintained its legitimacy. But as the currency became worthless, the government increasingly demanded taxes be paid in kind in actual goods and produce. Peasants were forced to hand over portions of their harvest, their livestock, and THEIR Chinese letter CRFTS directly to the state. For the ambitious and well-connected, this system created opportunities for corruption, as officials could demand more than was owed and pocket the difference. But for the vast majority, particularly the curial class, the local city councillors and moderate landowners who formed the backbone of the empire's administration, it was a death sentence. These men were personally responsible for collecting their town's tax quota from the surrounding countryside. If the harvest failed or the population shrank, they were legally obligated to make up the difference from their own personal fortunes. As the economic crisis deepened, this responsibility transformed from a civic duty into a ruinous liability. Many of these middling landowners, once the proud epitome of Roman civic life, were driven into bankruptcy, abandoning their positions and their lands to escape the relentless tax collectors. Their estates were often absorbed by the only class that could still thrive, the ultra-wealthy senatorial aristocracy. These powerful magnates lived on vast, self-sufficient country villas or latifundia that operated like miniature kingdoms. They had their own private armies of slaves and dependent farmers, their own workshops, and their own stores of grain. Heavily fortified and economically independent, they were increasingly disconnected from the failing fortunes of the Roman state. They could use their influence to secure tax exemptions, hoard their wealth in gold and silver bullion, and ride out the economic storm, further starving the central government of the resources it desperately needed to survive. The immense, crushing weight of taxation didn't just fund the state. It actively broke the social and economic structure that supported it, hollowing out the middle and concentrating wealth and power in the hands of a few who had less and less interest in saving the empire as a whole. The final blow to the economic engine was the slow, inexorable severing of the trade routes that had once been the arteries of imperial prosperity. The Mediterranean Sea, once a Roman lake humming with commercial traffic, became a dangerous and fractured space. With the empire's loss of naval supremacy, piracy resurged, making merchant voyages a risky gamble. But the greater disruption came from the barbarian invasions and the establishment of Germanic kingdoms within the old imperial borders. These new political entities did not seek to destroy trade, but they fundamentally altered its flow. The old, centralized system that saw goods moving from province to province under the protection of a single state was replaced by a patchwork of local and regional networks. A merchant traveling from Gaul to Italy now had to cross multiple borders, deal with different tribal authorities, and pay new and unpredictable tariffs. The magnificent Roman roads, though still physically present, were no longer maintained by a central authority and became susceptible to banditry, making overland transport far more perilous. The most devastating single loss was the Vandal conquest of North Africa. This event did more than just deprive the city of Rome of its grain supply. It cut the vital trade link between the eastern and western Mediterranean. The Vandals, with their powerful fleet, became the masters of the Central Med, raiding coastlines and intercepting shipping at will. The flow of African grain, Spanish oil, and eastern silks to the west slowed to a trickle. Without the tax revenue and goods from these provinces, the cities of the west, which were entirely dependent on this imported sustenance, began to wither. Urban populations shrank as people moved to the countryside to be closer to sources of food. Grand public markets, once filled with exotic goods from 3 continents, were abandoned or repurposed. The complex, interdependent economy that defined Roman life reverted to a simpler, localized state. A potter in Britain could no longer expect to sell his wares in markets in Gaul. He now served only his immediate village. This dramatic simplification and localization of the economy meant the immense wealth generated by long-distance trade, the wealth that paid for the legions, the baths, and the aqueducts, simply vanished. The engine had run out of fuel, and the machine of state, starved of resources and crippled by inefficiency, had no choice but to fall silent. Perhaps no transformation was more symbolic of the empire's decay than the slow, steady dilution of its most vital institution, the Roman army. The legendary legions, the iron-disciplined professional force that had carved out an empire and defended it for centuries, underwent a change so profound that they became almost unrecognizable. The core of this transformation was a shift from a standing army of citizen soldiers, motivated by patriotism and the promise of a land grant, to a mercenary force of barbarian recruits whose loyalty was a fleeting thing, purchased with gold and conditional on continued payment. The term for these allied troops was foederati, a name derived from the Latin word for treaty, foedus. On the surface, this policy seemed like a practical solution to a pressing manpower shortage. The empire's population was declining, and fewer citizens from Italy and the old Romanized provinces were willing to endure the brutal 25-year service term. At the same time, the Germanic tribes pressing against the frontiers possessed a seemingly endless supply of young, tough warriors, eager to fight and deeply impressed by Roman wealth and military prestige. It was a simple, seductive logic. Why not use the barbarians to fight the barbarians? But this short-term fix created a devastating long-term dependency. The relationship between the empire and its foederati was a tense and precarious bargain. A tribal chieftain would pledge the military service of his entire people in exchange for the right to settle on Roman land, annual payments of gold and supplies. On paper, these warriors were integrated into the Roman military structure, fighting under Roman command. In reality, they often remained a separate entity, loyal first and foremost to their own chieftain, who himself was loyal only as long as the Roman gold kept flowing. The Roman state, in its increasing weakness, was essentially outsourcing its own defense to the very groups that had so recently been its enemies. The visual evolution of the army tells this story clearly. Imagine a timeline of military equipment. The early imperial legionary, a symbol of uniformity and state power, is clad in segmented plate armor, the famous lorica segmentata, carrying a heavy javelin and a short, stabbing sword. His helmet and large curved shield all mass-produced in imperial workshops to a single standard. Now fast forward a few centuries, the soldier standing guard on a crumbling wall in Gaul looks entirely different. He wears a chainmail shirt, perhaps a spoil taken from a fallen Frankish warrior. He carries a long sword and a framer, a Germanic spear. His shield is simpler, his helmet a simpler, more utilitarian design. He is, for all intents and purposes, a barbarian warrior, but he draws a ration of grain and a few silver coins from a Roman quartermaster. The Roman army had not just recruited barbarians, it had in many ways become barbarian, adopting their tactics, their equipment, and most dangerously, their fractured loyalties. This reliance on foreign troops created a perilous inversion of power. The foederati were not stationed only on distant frontiers as a buffer. They were often billeted deep within the empire's heartlands in Italy and Gaul itself. This gave their chieftains an intimate and dangerous knowledge of Roman weaknesses. They saw the opulent villas of the wealthy aristocracy, the undefended riches of ancient cities, and the political paralysis of the court in Ravenna. A general like Stilicho or Ricimer, though he might hold the lofty Roman title of Magister Militum, was often a man of barbarian descent himself, commanding an army that answered to him personally, not to the abstract concept of Rome. The state had effectively handed over the keys to its own security to men who had no innate stake in its survival. The result was a complete erosion of the army's ability to project power or even guarantee basic defense. When a new threat emerged, like the Vandals crossing into Africa, there were no longer any reliable, mobile legions to send. The available forces were either tied down guarding against their own foederati neighbors or were themselves the foederati, who might refuse to fight their distant cousins or simply demand a higher price to do so. The empire lost the initiative entirely, forced to react to events from a position of chronic weakness, always negotiating, always paying, always conceding. The army, once the instrument that created the Pax Romana, had become a collection of expensive, unpredictable mercenary bands, a mirror reflecting the fragmented and hollowed-out state it was paid to protect. As the economic and military foundations of the empire began to crumble, a quieter, more insidious decay was taking hold within the very class that had once been responsible for its governance. The Roman elite, the senators and wealthy landowners who for centuries had defined themselves by their service to the Republic and later the Empire, underwent a profound philosophical shift. The old ideal of civic virtue, the belief that a man's highest calling was to contribute to the public good through military command, political office, and patronage of his community, slowly faded from fashion. It was replaced by a growing sense of disillusionment and a retreat into private life. The endless civil wars, the constant threat of assassination, and the spectacle of emperors rising and falling at the whim of the army made participation in the messy business of central government seem less like an honor and more like a lethal risk. Why strive for a precarious consulship in Rome when you could be the unchallenged master of your own vast domain in the countryside? This retreat from public duty was not a sudden exodus, but a gradual, generational withdrawal, a turning inward that left the machinery of state to be operated by increasingly desperate emperors and their barbarian generals. The physical manifestation of this philosophical retreat was the latifundia, the enormous, self-sufficient country estates that became the new focal point of aristocratic life. These were not simple farms, they were miniature, fortified city-states, sprawling complexes designed to provide everything the owner and his dependents could possibly need, insulated from the chaos of the failing world outside. Picture a vast tract of land, perhaps a full day's ride across, with its own vineyards, olive groves, grain fields, and pastures. At its heart stood the villa itself, a palatial residence that blended the traditional Roman atrium with luxurious Eastern influences. The walls were adorned with breathtaking mosaics depicting scenes of bountiful harvests, mythological tales, or intricate geometric patterns. Art that celebrated the owner's wealth and cultured taste, utterly divorced from the grim reality of imperial collapse. These villas had their own workshops for weaving cloth and crafting tools, their own bakeries, their own reservoirs and bathhouses. They were economic powerhouses, but they were also islands of isolation. The social structure within these estates further deepened the divide. The land was worked by a growing population of coloni, tenants who were legally free but were increasingly bound to the land they farmed, a precursor to the serfdom of the Middle Ages. Alongside them labored slaves, prisoners of war from the empire's countless conflicts. The estate owner, the dominus, was their judge, their commander, and their provider. His loyalty was to his family, his clients, and the preservation of his own wealth. The imperial tax collector might still appear at the gates, but a powerful dominus with his own small army of retainers could often negotiate favorable terms or simply refuse to pay, knowing the weakened state had little power to compel him. This hyper-localization of power meant that the immense private wealth of the empire was effectively walled off from the state. The gold, silver, and agricultural surplus that had once flowed into the imperial treasury to pay soldiers and officials now accumulated in the strongrooms of private villas, hoarded for the security of a single family rather than invested in the security of the entire empire. The contrast between this private opulence and public decay could not have been more stark. Imagine the scene: a wealthy senator rides from his lavish villa, its floors glittering with newly laid mosaics, and travels to the nearest city, perhaps a provincial capital that was once a bustling center of Roman administration. What he would have found was a poignant picture of decline. The grand public forum, once the heart of civic life where citizens gathered for business, politics, and gossip, was now often neglected. Weeds pushed through the cracks in the paving stones, The statue of a long-forgotten emperor stood covered in grime, its inscription faded. The great basilica, the hall of justice and commerce, might be partially abandoned. Its echoing space is now home to makeshift stalls and a fraction of its former activity. The public baths, if they were still open, might operate on reduced hours, the complex plumbing system beginning to fail for lack of skilled engineers and maintenance. The elite had taken their wealth, their energy, and their sense of responsibility with them behind the walls of their estates. They had created their own comfortable, self-contained worlds, turning their backs on the crumbling public infrastructure that had been the proud hallmark of Roman civilization. In doing so, they abandoned the central government to its fate, creating a paradox where the empire's greatest sources of private wealth became active contributors to its public impoverishment, ensuring that when the final crisis came, the state stood utterly alone. But even as the legions changed and the economy faltered, the most fundamental resource of any state, its people, was quietly vanishing. A relentless decline in population swept across the Roman world, a silent crisis that drained the empire of its vitality from within. This was not a single catastrophe, but a slow, grinding process of attrition, a gradual emptying of the countryside and the cities that left the empire weaker with each passing generation. The most dramatic accelerants of this decline were the great pandemics that periodically swept through the densely populated provinces, events of such staggering mortality that they left a permanent scar on the collective memory of the ancient world. The first of these, the Antonine Plague, struck during the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the late 2nd century. Believed by many historians to have been smallpox or measles, it was brought back to the Mediterranean by legions returning from campaigns in the Near East. The disease raged for 15 years, sweeping through cities and military camps with terrifying efficiency. Ancient sources describe streets filled with the dead, entire households wiped out, and even the emperor himself eventually succumbing to the illness. The death toll was astronomical, with modern estimates suggesting it may have killed a quarter of the empire's population, a loss of millions that crippled both the economy and the army at the height of Rome's power. A century later, an even deadlier blow fell, the Plague of Cyprian, named for the Christian bishop of Carthage who left vivid, horrifying eyewitness accounts. This pandemic, which some scholars now suspect was a hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola, struck in the middle of the 3rd century, precisely when the empire was already reeling from foreign invasions and civil war. Cyprian's writings describe a sickness so violent it brought commerce and agriculture to a standstill. He tells of bodies piling up in the streets, of a pervasive fear that paralyzed society, and of a death toll so high that it surpassed any previous record. The plague moved through the empire in waves over nearly 2 decades, killing indiscriminately and further hollowing out a population already under immense strain. The combined effect of these 2 pandemics was catastrophic. They did not just represent a one-time loss of life, they created a demographic crater from which the empire never truly recovered. A smaller population meant a smaller tax base, starving the state of the revenue it desperately needed to maintain the armies and infrastructure that had once kept the peace. It also meant fewer young men were available for military service, forcing the increased reliance on barbarian foederati that would ultimately undermine the army's loyalty. Beyond the sudden horror of plague, the constant background noise of warfare and economic hardship made the simple act of raising a family a daunting challenge. For a peasant farmer, the prospect of feeding multiple children through a drought or a bad harvest was a grim calculation. In an economy increasingly based on barter and localized scarcity, more children meant more mouths to feed, not more hands to work, at least in the short term. The widespread practice of infant exposure, where unwanted newborns were left outdoors to die or be taken by strangers, speaks to the brutal realities of family planning in an age of desperation. For those who survived childhood, life was often short and arduous. Constant recruitment drives for the legions took young men from the fields for 25 years of service, and many never returned, either dying in battle or settling far from home after their discharge. The civil wars of the 3rd century were particularly devastating, fought not on distant frontiers but within the empire's own heartland, destroying farms, disrupting planting seasons, and leading to widespread famine that killed just as effectively as any sword. The population decline was a quiet, relentless drain, a slow bleeding that left villages abandoned, fields fallow, and the once teeming cities of the West feeling increasingly hollow and empty, their grand public spaces now too large for the diminished number of citizens who remained to fill them. This spiritual revolution, which began under Constantine, did not simply add a new layer to Roman life. It slowly and profoundly rewrote the entire social contract, redirecting the flow of ambition, wealth, and intellectual capital in ways that ultimately weakened the secular state it was meant to bless. The ancient Roman ideal had always been a virtuous life dedicated to public service, serving as a senator, a governor, or a military commander to uphold the glory of the Republic and then the empire. A man's legacy was measured in the roads he built, the laws he passed, the victories he won for Rome. But as Christianity ascended to become the state religion, a powerful new path to prestige and purpose emerged. The most ambitious, charitable, and intellectually gifted citizens now had an alternative to the Forum. They could seek glory not in the service of the emperor, but in the service of God. This shift manifested in a dramatic flow of private wealth away from the traditional civic projects that had defined Roman urban life for centuries. Where once a wealthy patrician might have donated a new aqueduct, a public bath complex, or funded gladiatorial games to earn the admiration of his peers, his descendants now poured their fortunes into the construction of magnificent basilicas, the endowment of monasteries, and the creation of breathtaking religious art. Gold that might have paid a legion's salary for a year was instead lavished on golden altar fittings, intricately woven clerical vestments, and illuminated manuscripts painstakingly crafted by scribes over countless months. The soaring church interiors we might see in our visuals, with their shimmering mosaics and vast, open spaces, were not just places of worship, they were monuments to a massive transfer of capital. This redirection of resources was spiritually magnificent, but it came at a cost to the temporal state. The public baths began to crumble without their wealthy patrons, the aqueducts silted up without maintenance, and the secular infrastructure that had supported Roman cities for generations gradually decayed as both money and civic pride were funneled into the eternal rather than the earthly city. Parallel to this flow of wealth was an equally significant migration of the empire's finest minds. The vibrant tradition of classical philosophy, with its debates on ethics, governance, and the natural world, faced a formidable rival in Christian theology. The great philosophical schools of Athens and Alexandria, which had produced thinkers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, gradually dimmed as the most brilliant scholars turned their analytical powers toward interpreting scripture, debating the nature of the Trinity, and refining church doctrine. Monasteries, which began to dot the landscape from the deserts of Egypt to the hills of Gaul, became the new repositories of learning, but their focus was inherently different. Within their walls, the works of Cicero and Virgil were often copied and preserved, but they were frequently seen as a prelude to the greater truth of the Gospels rather than a foundation for civic life. The intellectual energy that had once been devoted to solving the practical problems of governing a vast empire, law, administration, engineering, was now increasingly channeled into theological disputes. While these debates were of immense importance to the soul, they did little to address the pressing secular crises of barbarian invasions, food shortages, and economic collapse. The state was slowly being starved not only of money, but of the innovative and practical intelligence it desperately needed to navigate its mortal challenges. Perhaps the most disruptive effect of this new faith was the creation of a competing center of authority that existed within, yet often apart from, the imperial structure. The Church developed its own hierarchy, its own laws, and its own source of legitimacy, which derived from God rather than the emperor. This set the stage for a tension that would define much of European history, the conflict between church and state. We see this vividly in the famous confrontations between powerful bishops and secular rulers. The most iconic example is the encounter between Ambrose, the powerful bishop of Milan, and the Emperor Theodosius the Great. After Theodosius ordered a brutal massacre of civilians in Thessalonica, Ambrose did not merely offer quiet counsel. He publicly excommunicated the most powerful man in the world, denying him communion and access to the church until he performed public penance. The emperor, humbled, eventually complied. This was an unprecedented act, a religious leader holding a Roman emperor accountable to a higher moral law, demonstrating that the authority of the church could, at times, supersede that of the throne. This new dynamic created a divided loyalty for many citizens. Were one's ultimate obligations to the emperor in Rome or Ravenna, or to the Pope and the church? As the imperial government grew weaker and more distant, the local bishop often emerged as the most powerful and stabilizing figure in a community, organizing defenses, feeding the poor, and negotiating with barbarian chieftains. The church became a state within a state, a parallel institution that would outlast the empire itself, providing continuity and order even as the old secular framework collapsed into silence. This relentless turnover of power began almost as soon as the golden age of the 5 good emperors ended. That period itself was an anomaly, a run of successions not by blood but by adoption, where each emperor chose the most capable man in the empire to follow him. This system collapsed with Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5, who broke with tradition and left the throne to his own son, Commodus. This single decision is often seen as the pivot point, the moment the principle of merit was sacrificed for the dangerous gamble of dynastic inheritance. Commodus, who fancied himself a reincarnation of the hero Hercules, was wildly unstable, more interested in performing as a gladiator in the arena than in governing the empire. His assassination in 192 left a power vacuum that the army was all too eager to fill. The year that followed, known as the Year of the 5 Emperors, set a terrifying precedent. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own personal protectors stationed in Rome, literally auctioned the throne to the highest bidder, a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus. But out in the provinces, powerful generals commanding loyal legions had other ideas. Septimius Severus, governor of Upper Pannonia, marched on Rome with his battle-hardened troops from the Danube. He seized power, executed his rivals, and then had to spend the next few years fighting other claimants in bloody civil wars that stretched from Gaul to Syria. His dying words to his sons, Caracalla and Geta, were a recipe for disaster. Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men. They ignored the first part. Caracalla murdered his brother to rule alone, and the lesson of enriching the soldiers became the unbreakable and ultimately ruinous rule for every emperor who followed. What followed was a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle that would drain the empire's strength for the next 100 years. A general would proclaim himself emperor. To secure the loyalty of the troops who backed him, he had to immediately give them a massive cash bonus, the notorious donativum, draining the treasury. Then, to prove his legitimacy and fund his rule, he would have to march against rival emperors proclaimed by other legions in other provinces. These internal conflicts were often far more brutal and destructive than wars against foreign enemies. Roman would fight Roman, the empire's best soldiers killing each other on battlefields from Spain to Mesopotamia. Imagine the scene: 2 identical legions, trained in the same tactics, wearing the same armor, clashing in a horrific spectacle of civil butchery. With the armies pulled away to fight each other, the frontiers were left defenseless, inviting waves of invasions from Germanic tribes and the powerful Persian Empire. The emperor would then have to rush from putting down one internal revolt to fighting off an external threat. only to be overthrown by his own troops if he failed to deliver another round of pay or a swift victory. The 3rd century turned this cycle into a grotesque rhythm. Emperor Maximinus Thrax, a giant of a man who rose from the ranks, was killed by his own men for being too harsh. The teenage emperors Gordian I and Gordian II died within months of each other, one by suicide, the other in battle. Emperor Philip the Arab, who celebrated Rome's 1000th birthday, was killed in battle by a usurper. Valerian was captured by the Persians, a humiliation no Roman emperor had ever suffered. His son, Gallienus, ruled for 15 years, a miracle of longevity in this period, but spent his entire reign putting down one usurper after another, a task so common it was known as the Gallic Empire had broken away in the west, and a separate realm had formed in the east under Queen Zenobia. This era of the barracks emperors, so named because so many were common soldiers elevated by the troops, created a culture of permanent instability. The map of the empire during this time would look like a flickering light, with rival emperors controlling different chunks of territory, their borders shifting with each battle. Claudius Gothicus, who won a great victory against the Goths, died of plague after 2 years. His successor, Aurelian, was a brilliant commander who finally defeated Zenobia and reconquered the breakaway empires, earning the title Restitutor Orbis, or Restorer of the World. But even he could not escape the curse of the age. He was murdered by a group of officers who mistakenly believed he had sentenced them to death. The message to every man with a sword was clear. The purple robe of emperor was there for the taking. All it required was the loyalty of a few legions and the audacity to seize it. This constant civil war did more than just kill emperors. It bled the army white, exhausted the treasury with endless donatives, and shattered the illusion of imperial unity. It taught generations of soldiers that their loyalty was to the general who paid them, not to the abstract idea of Rome, a lesson that would eventually allow barbarian commanders to become the true powers behind a crumbling throne. The administrative split that Diocletian engineered to save the empire ultimately became the very fault line along which it broke apart. His system, designed for efficiency and rapid response, created 2 distinct political entities that slowly grew apart in their interests, their resources, and their very identities. What began as a pragmatic division of labor curdled into a bitter separation, a geopolitical divorce where the stronger, wealthier partner increasingly saw the weaker one as a burdensome liability, not a cherished sibling. The Eastern Court, secure behind the mighty walls of Constantinople and enriched by the bustling trade routes of the Aegean and Black Seas, developed a different perspective. From their vantage point, the western provinces seemed like a bottomless pit of problems, a constant drain on gold and manpower with ever-diminishing returns. Emperors and their advisors in the East began to calculate the cost-benefit analysis of sending legions to fight in distant Gaul or Italy, only to see those same legions vanish in civil wars or be annihilated by new barbarian incursions. The sense of a shared Roman destiny, of a single imperium, began to fray, replaced by a cold, calculating realism that prioritized the survival of the East above the salvation of the West. This growing reluctance to aid the West was starkly visible in the failed military campaigns that were supposed to demonstrate imperial unity. A prime example is the ambitious but disastrous expedition of the Eastern Emperor Valens to aid his nephew, the Western Emperor Gratian, against the Goths. Pressured to respond to Gothic depredations in the Balkans and desperate for a victory to call his own, Valens engaged the enemy at Adrianople in 378 without waiting for Gratian's reinforcements. The result was a cataclysm, the annihilation of a full Roman field army and the death of the emperor himself. This disaster was born not of coordination, but of rivalry and miscommunication between the two courts. Later, during the massive invasions of Attila the Hun, the Eastern strategy was one of appeasement, paying a hefty annual tribute in gold to keep the Huns focused on attacking the West. This was a deliberate, if cynical, calculation. It was cheaper to pay off the threat and let it become someone else's problem than to exhaust the Eastern treasuries and armies in a potentially ruinous war. The few times Eastern forces did intervene in the West, such as during the reign of the Eastern Emperor Anthemius, who was sent to rule in Ravenna, the efforts were often hamstrung by a lack of genuine commitment and local suspicion, ending in further discord rather than renewed strength. The financial separation was even more profound. The two halves developed entirely independent fiscal systems with their own treasuries, tax collection agencies, and monetary policies. The East, with its dense network of wealthy, tax-paying cities and control of the lucrative trade with Persia, India, and China, amassed a vast and reliable surplus of gold. The famous Byzantine solidus became the dollar of the medieval world, a currency of such unwavering purity and reliability that it was trusted from London to Canton for over 700 years. The West, by contrast, was trapped in a death spiral of debased currency and collapsing tax revenue. Its pleas for financial subsidies were often met with hesitation or outright refusal from Constantinople. Sending gold to the West felt like pouring it into a sieve. It would be immediately spent on bribing one barbarian army to fight another, or simply stolen in the next palace coup. The Eastern attitude hardened into a policy of triage. Why waste precious resources propping up a terminally ill patient when those same resources could be used to strengthen the healthy one? This was not mere selfishness. It was a brutal, pragmatic assessment of survival in a world that was growing darker by the decade. The fatal fracture was now complete. The East had the wealth but not the will to save the West, and the West, starved of that support and consumed by its own crises, was left to face the gathering storm alone. To fully grasp the chain of events that brought the Roman world to its knees, we must cast our gaze far beyond its own borders to the vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia. It was here, in a distant and mysterious land the Romans called Scythia, that a new and terrifying power began to coalesce: the Hunnic Confederation. These were nomadic pastoralists, a people whose entire existence was shaped by the horse and the bow, for whom mobility and warfare were not just tactics but a way of life. Their exact origins are shrouded in the mists of the steppe, but their impact was devastatingly clear. Driven by a combination of climatic shifts, population pressures, and their own fierce ambition, they began a westward migration that would send a shockwave through the entire continent. Picture this immense, moving force not as a single army, but as a migrating people, warriors, families, and their vast herds flowing across the landscape like a human tide, their approach heralded by a cloud of dust on the horizon and a low, ominous rumble that was felt long before it was heard. The first to feel the irresistible force of this Hunnic advance were the various Germanic tribes living in the Great Plains north of the Black Sea, most notably the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. For these tribes, the arrival of the Huns was an apocalypse. Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, our best source for these events, describes them as a race of savage beings scarcely human, who seemed to be grafted onto their small, ugly horses, fighting with a chaotic ferocity that was utterly alien to the disciplined Roman legions. The Goths, though formidable warriors themselves, were utterly overwhelmed. Their king, Ermanaric, is said to have taken his own life in despair at the onslaught. The Huns shattered the Ostrogothic kingdom, subjugating many of its people and absorbing them into their own growing empire. This initial collision was the first and most decisive domino to fall. The Gothic world was broken apart, its people sent fleeing in panic, with only one direction offering any hope of escape: west toward the Danube River, the centuries-old boundary of the Roman Empire. This is where the simple metaphor of invading barbarians becomes a far more complex and tragic story of mass migration and desperate negotiation. The tens of thousands of Goths who now crowded the northern bank of the Danube in the year 376 were not an invading army in the traditional sense. They were refugees, an entire nation on the move, comprising not just soldiers but women, children, and the elderly, exhausted and terrified, pleading for sanctuary from the existential threat at their backs. They appealed to the Eastern Roman Emperor, Valens, arguing that they could be a valuable source of new soldiers and farmers for the empire if granted land and protection. For Valens, this presented a tremendous opportunity and a terrible risk. He saw a chance to bolster his military with a massive influx of hardy Gothic warriors at a time of rising threats. After considerable debate, he made the fateful decision to grant them entry. What followed was a catastrophic failure of logistics and humanity that perfectly illustrates the administrative decay of the late empire. The process of ferrying this huge population across the river was slow and chaotic. Once inside the empire, the promised food and supplies were not provided. The local Roman commanders, corrupt and incompetent, saw the starving Goths not as future citizens but as a resource to be exploited. They extorted them, famously trading them dog meat for their children who were taken into slavery. This cruel and short-sighted betrayal turned a manageable refugee crisis into a full-blown military revolt. The desperate and enraged Goths, now under new leaders like Fritigern, took up arms and began to plunder the rich, undefended province of Thrace. They were no longer pleading for help. They were fighting for survival and revenge, using the very weapons and tactics they had once hoped to employ in Rome's service. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would shatter the Roman army's aura of invincibility forever. A disaster that began not with a declaration of war, but with a plea for mercy that was heartlessly denied.